90 seconds. That's how long Katt Williams stood on a Detroit stage and said absolutely nothing. No bit, no punchline, no sound at all, while 214 people slowly stopped breathing. November 2005. The Mercury Room, a low-ceilinged 200-seat comedy club off Woodward Avenue. The kind of place where the beer was warm by the second joke and the audience talked back whether you wanted them to or not. At the back of that room, hunched over a scratched-up soundboard, sat a 61-year-old man named Eugene Marsh. Gene, to everybody who'd known him across 30 years of running sound in that city. And for the first 30 of those 90 seconds, Gene Marsh was absolutely certain of one thing. The board had died. His hand was already moving toward the master fader. His eyes were already scanning the meters. Because in 3 decades, Gene had learned that silence on stage meant one thing and one thing only. Something had broken. He was wrong. And what he understood by the time the 90 seconds ran out, he'd spend the rest of his life trying to explain to people who weren't in the room. Let's go back. Gene Marsh had been running sound at the Mercury Room since it was called something else. He'd mixed for headliners and hacks, for legends passing through, and for kids who'd never work again after that Tuesday. He knew the room the way a piano tuner knows a piano. Every dead spot, every place the low end turned to mud. And Gene was tired. He'll tell you that himself. "I was done," he said years later. 30 years of hearing grown men yell into a microphone. I thought I'd heard every single thing a person could do with a stage. The club's owner had started talking about a new digital board, a younger guy who could run it off a laptop. Gene understood what that meant. So the night the small comedian from Cincinnati showed up, sharp little suit, hair pressed and shining, barely came up to the doorframe. Gene did not expect much. "Sound check?" Gene asked. Katt Williams checked the mic, said 2 words into it, listened to the room swallow them, and nodded. "It's a good room," he said. "It just doesn't know it yet." Gene wrote that off as showbiz talk. But there was one thing. Before the kid left the stage, he stood dead center for a second, just listening. Not to anything, just to the empty room breathing. Gene had never once seen a comic listen to a room that had nobody in it. He filed it away and thought nothing more of it. He'd think about it plenty later. The crowd that Tuesday was the wrong crowd. There's a thing every club person knows. Some nights the room is a single animal, breathing together, easy to lead. And some nights it's 200 separate arguments happening at once. This was the second kind. A bachelorette party, 6 deep at the bar. A table of guys who'd clearly started drinking at lunch. Somebody's phone going off to a ringtone that sounded like a slot machine paying out. The first comic died standing up. The second did 4 minutes and waved the white flag. Then Katt Williams walked out, adjusted that pressed suit like the Mercury Room was Carnegie Hall, and leaned into Gene's microphone. For about 11 minutes it worked. He was fast. He did voices, a whole argument between a Detroit pothole and the city budget, and the drunk table actually laughed. There was one moment Gene never forgot. A man near the front, arms crossed, hadn't cracked once, the toughest kind of face in any club. Katt clocked him, held on him, did a whole bit aimed at exactly that man's stubbornness, and Gene watched the crossed arms come apart. The tough guy laughed against his own will. "He was good," Gene admitted. "I'll give the kid that. He was quick. But quick wasn't going to be enough. Not with this room. And Gene could feel it turning. He could always feel it turning before anybody on stage could. It started at the bachelorette table. One of them stood up, sash, tiara, the whole thing, and started narrating her own trip to the bathroom, loud, cutting right across the punchline. The drunk table picked it up. Somebody whistled. The slot machine ringtone went off again, and this time nobody silenced it. One distraction, then another. Then the whole room, all at once, remembering it hadn't come here to listen. Gene's hands went to the board on instinct. This was the part where he'd push the vocal, give the comic more power, more volume, help him shout the room down. That was the move. 30 years, that was always the move. Turn him up. Let him fight. Gene's fingers found the fader. And on stage, Katt Williams did the opposite of everything Gene expected. He stopped talking. Not a pause. Not a hold for laugh. He simply stopped. He took one step back from the microphone. He set his weight on his back foot, and he waited. "I thought he'd frozen," Gene said. "I thought the kid had finally hit a room too big for him and locked up. That's a comic dying. I felt bad for him." Gene did not push the vocal. Later, he couldn't tell you why. Something made him take his hand off the board. That's when it happened. The silence had weight. That's the only way Gene ever found to describe it. 10 seconds of it. The bachelorette kept talking, then heard herself, alone, and sat down. 15 seconds. The drunk table went quiet, not because anyone shushed them, but because the quiet was suddenly louder than they were. 30 seconds. Gene looked down at his meters. Flat. No signal. Dead air. And this is the part he swears to. At about the 30-second mark, Gene Marsh, 30 years at that board, the man who knew that silence meant something was broken, reached again for the master fader, absolutely convinced the board had failed him, convinced it was on him. He pulled his hand back a second time. 45 seconds. A full room, packed shoulder to shoulder, and Gene could hear the ice settling in a glass at the bar. He could hear the traffic on Woodward through the front wall. He could hear a man 3 rows back swallow. 60 seconds. Nobody laughed. Nobody heckled. Nobody moved. 214 people, and the loudest thing in the Mercury room was a comedian saying nothing at all. "I have never," Gene said, "in my whole life, heard a room that quiet with people still in it." At 90 seconds, Gene knows it was 90 because he looked at the board clock when it started, and again when it broke. Katt Williams stepped back to the microphone. He didn't shout. He didn't reset. He didn't win the room back with a big joke. He looked out at the bachelorette, at the drunks, at all 214 of them who were now leaning toward him like he was the only warm thing in a cold building, and he said one quiet line. "See," he said, "now we're all here." The room came apart. Not a laugh, a roar. The kind of sound a crowd makes when it's been let in on something. The bachelorette table was on its feet. The drunks were pounding the table. And for the next 40 minutes, Katt Williams owned that room so completely that when the kitchen closed, nobody left. And when the lights came up, people stayed in their seats like they were waiting for more. Gene sat behind his dead flat meters and understood, all at once, the thing that 30 years had never taught him. The kid hadn't lost the room. He'd stopped fighting it. He'd made the silence do the work that Gene had spent 3 decades trying to do with volume. "Every comic I ever ran sound for wanted me to turn him up," Gene said. "That was the only night somebody got louder by going quiet." Here's what Gene did after.
The cue sheet from that night was a plain, photocopied grid, the kind he filled out for every show and threw in a drawer and forgot. But on that one, in the margin, in ballpoint, Gene had written down 2 times as they happened, out of 30 years of habit. 9:47 and 9:49. The start and the end of the dead air. He'd written them expecting to file a complaint about his own board. He never threw that cue sheet away. The digital board came the next spring, just like the owner said. A younger guy came with it. Gene stayed on part-time for a while, then not at all. He'll tell you it was time, but he ran sound differently for whatever time he had left. He stopped reaching for the fader every time a room went quiet. "I used to think dead air was the enemy," he said. "That kid taught me it was an instrument. I just never knew how to play it." Katt Williams did not stay a small comic in a warm beer club for long. Within a year, the name was moving. Within 2, The Pimp Chronicles was on HBO, and the man who'd stood silent for 90 seconds in Detroit was selling out rooms 100 times the size of the Mercury. Gene watched it happen from his living room. Every special, he said, there'd be a moment, a beat, a hold, a pause a half-second longer than any other comic would dare, where the whole arena would lean in. And Gene, alone on his couch, would lean in too. Every time. The Mercury Room closed for good in 2014. The building's a phone store now. Gene drove past it once, he said, and couldn't even find the door where the stage door used to be. But the cue sheet is still real. Gene Marsh keeps it in a kitchen drawer under the takeout menus, a soft, creased square of paper with 2 ballpoint times in the margin, 9:47 to 9:49. The only record anywhere that on a cold Tuesday in November 2005, a room full of strangers went silent for 90 seconds and learned something none of them could name. They look at it, and they see 2 little numbers, Gene said, and he laughed the way old men laugh at things that are too big to explain. They weren't in the room. You had to be in the room. You had to feel a comedian make 200 people go quiet and then thank them for it. He was quiet a moment himself then. "Everybody thinks the job is filling the silence," he finally said. "The best one I ever saw did the whole thing by protecting it. 90 seconds. I keep waiting to hear a room that quiet again. I've been waiting 19 years. 2 little numbers in the margin of a cue sheet in a kitchen drawer in Detroit. 9:47 to 9:49. The 2 minutes a tired man behind a soundboard almost interrupted and spent the rest of his life glad he didn't. If this story reached something in you, take a second to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these untold stories find the people who need them. And tell us in the comments, have you ever been in a room that went completely silent, a theater, a church, a service, and felt that stillness hit harder than any sound? We read every one.